cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window. The fire crackled as we sat in the front yard, the crickets tuning up and the little stream lapping at its banks. The snow melt had been thick that year. The small cold snap that we had experienced the first week of June hadn't hurt it either. I'd been living with Grandpa for nearly a year now, 10 months to be exact, and he had been making these bonfires a near constant thing ever since the first snow melt in spring. They suited me just fine. I'd been cleaning up the spring limb falls since April, and the bonfire made a perfect excuse to get rid of the limbs. Wait, you were just wandering in the woods and found a house? I asked. Grandpa snorted. You telling this story, or am I? I raised a hand in placation and invited him to continue. Grandpa did not like being interrupted. There was a little more to it than that. Weren't you paying attention? I looked away sheepishly. I had been kind of hypnotized by the sounds of nature and had only been half listening to Grandpa's story. It was just so peaceful out here at night, with only the fire and the bubble of darkness around you. I liked Grandpa's stories almost as much as you all seem to, but I still get distracted every now and again. Grandpa settled himself again, giving me a look that clearly bemoaned the attention spans of the young, and began his story again. I was young when this happened. It was after my friend had become a tree, but before Grandma had begun to teach me the ways of the woods. I had started taking to the woods more often, not having anyone to play with much, and sometimes I would camp all weekend in the Appalachian Hills. My parents never worried about me. They knew that I knew the hills and hollers like the back of my hand. So when I kissed Mama goodbye one morning, my rucksack packed, she told me to be home by Saturday night so I wouldn't be late for church on Sunday. I told her I would and set out to camp in the woods for the next 2 nights. This was high summer, late June or early July, and it was about as hot as it ever got beneath the canopy of those trees. I was looking forward to finding my way to a spot I knew of near the creek. I could fish and swim and generally enjoy my time in the woods. When I got to the widow's house, though, I hunkered for a moment to make sure the coast was clear. Not because I was afraid of any widow, mind you. She was supposed to have been dead for a long time, but her house still remained, and you never know who you might find using it. This was just after the Depression, and sometimes vags and tramps would use the woods for long-term camping. I had heard of them robbing people, and worse, and did not want to blunder into a group of them who might be squatting in the widow's house. The widow's house was a bit of an anomaly in the area. Terry Manx, just called the widow by the time I'd come along, had lived out in the house till she was about 100 years old, they said. Her husband had gone to fight in the Civil War, leaving her and her son behind. He had never returned, and when her son had disappeared a few years later, the widow had been heartbroken. She lived alone in that house, but travelers said they often saw a candle burning in the window, as if to guide her son and her husband home again. It's said she lived in that house from 1830 until she died in 1910. The townspeople didn't discover she had passed until someone noticed that the candle was no longer being lit and went to check on her one fateful night. The man had knocked, and upon receiving no answer, he had gone inside to check on the poor widow. She had lived there for so long, remaining independent till the last, and it was said that he found her in her rocking chair as she sat before the remains of her last fire. The candle was frozen in her mummified hand, and neither decay nor corruption had touched her. She had simply dried up into a wrinkled corpse that had been buried in her chair, or so the legend says. As if taking its cue from its mistress, the house remained eternally. It had sat in that little clearing since her death, and no amount of snow on the roof or water in the valley seemed to change it. 30 years after her death, the roof remained on, the windows remained intact. The house sat like a monument, and it would likely remain to this day if it weren't for me. Now, I wasn't afraid of anything like that. Even so, you wouldn't catch me staying there after sun went down, tramps or no tramps. After a few minutes of watching the house to make sure it wasn't full of homeless folks, I went along and put the house out of sight and out of mind. I spent the next 2 days doing just what I had wanted to do. I fished in the streams and explored the woods and cooked my catch over a fire. Friday night saw a creature approach my fire that I would later call a moonchild. It had smelled my fish and came to have a look, but that's a story for another time. I don't want to muddy the waters too much, and this story is about the widow's house, and, more specifically, the widow's candle. So, Saturday morning dawned warm and clear, and I decided to spend the day on the bank as I fished for some dinner to bring home with me. As I lay on the bank, pole balanced against my stomach, I found myself warm and comfy and utterly at peace. I could hear the birds as they called through the trees, and I could hear the squirrels as they played and moved in the brush. I heard the gentle lap of the stream and the splash of the small fish that swam there. Before I quite knew what was happening, I had slipped off into a nap and awoke to find the sun riding low and my bait all but gone. I judged by the sun that it was about 7 o'clock, and I cursed myself for sleeping away most of the day. I packed up quickly, but I knew I'd never make it home before dark. The sun was sinking even as I packed my things into my rucksack and started making my way home with all haste. I could hear the night birds beginning to tune up, and I wanted to be well and out of the woods before it got too dark. Regardless of my want, though, it was full dark by the time I made it back to the widow's house. As I got close, I felt like I could see a light coming from it. The forest is black dark at night, moon or no moon, and the light coming through the trees was like a beacon in the night. I thought about taking a wider trail around it after seeing the light, being sure it would be the light of a hobo campfire, but I was only 10, and I don't know a 10-year-old who isn't possessed with a wellspring of curiosity. As I got closer, I put my pack down and crept towards the house like an Indian raider on the prowl. The closer I got to the house, the less sure I became that it was a campfire. The blistering fire became smaller and smaller until I came to the edge of the clearing and found the source of the light. It was a candle, a single candle left burning on the windowsill, just as the widow used to do when she was calling her menfolk home. I hunkered at the edge of the property line, looking for people who might be hiding and finding no one. This would be a great way to draw in the curious, after all, leaving a candle burning on the sill, just like it says in the stories, and waiting for people to approach. You could hide beside the porch or even in the barn, and once you had them good and interested, you could spring out and have them. It was a great plan, except I didn't see anyone around. The porch held no hunkered brutes or half-starved tramps, and the barn was of the pole variety, and no hiding place there. They would have to be poor fellows indeed to hide anywhere on the property, and that just left someone in the house. I should have turned around and left, but I wanted a story to tell my friends when I went back to school next. How exciting it would be to sit in the warm sun on the playground and tell them all how I had seen a candle burning in the window of the widow's house. How they would gasp and sigh when I told them about how I had gone to the window to see who had lit the candle. And I could already see them putting their hands to their mouths and looking shocked when I told them what I had seen inside that place of bones. My curiosity wasn't the only thing that lured me to that house. I've always been a sucker for a good story, especially when it's a story I can tell others. But I suspect you've guessed that already. So there I was, standing on the porch with that candle burning behind that ancient glass window, gazing in on the one-room farmhouse that I suspect had once been considered spacious. I expected to see people in there, maybe even people trying to hide, and I kept myself low to avoid being seen. Inside, though, was very little to hide behind. A kitchen table, a few chairs, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a few bookshelves, and, to my horror, a rocking chair. A rocking chair with someone in it. The person was sitting in front of the fireplace, and I could see a dying fire smoldering in the grate. They were dressed in a long black dress, complete with a bonnet and everything, and a pair of knitting needles were moving slowly on their lap as they sat at work. The chair was going back and forth, and the whole scene was seeming pretty unreal. I backed away, trying to get back to my pack and get the hell out of there with my story. But that was when the door creaked open with a noise like a swollen hinge with a mouth full of rust. The voice that followed it sounded twice as creaky and just as spooky. "Thomas, is that you? It's dark, son. Can you come and help your poor mother?" I was frozen there, looking back at the door and at that raspy croaking that beckoned me inside. You likely won't believe me. None of my school friends did when I told them, but I was torn as I stood there with my fear crawling like bugs up my spine. On the one hand, the whole situation was just so weird, and all I wanted was to show my heels all the way home. On the other, this woman sounded old, possibly even infirm, and my mother had always taught me to help people in need. It was the Christian thing to do, after all, and as the creaky old voice asked if I was there, I took my first shaky steps onto the porch and walked into the widow's house. The inside was Spartan, but it was warm and dry for a house that had been empty for 30 years. I could now see why the vagrants liked it so much, and I imagined I could smell pastries and fresh bread as I crossed the threshold. The fire was warm too, and when the door didn't slam shut behind me to trap me inside, I felt that perhaps this was some old woman who had just gotten a little lost. "Thomas, is that you? I've waited so long for you, boy. Why have you kept your mother waiting?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm not Thomas. I think you must be mistaken," I said to her, but she cut me off before I could say much more, swishing her hands at the candle on the windowsill. "Bring that candle over here so I can have a look at you, Tommy. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and it's so dark in here." I thought that was odd. She was sitting right in front of the fire, after all, but I was too well-mannered to argue with her. I was becoming less and less afraid with every step I took, and when I picked the candle up, I saw the flame waft a little bit before it snuffed out. She tutted then, though how she could see that the flame had gone out was beyond me, but her words were good-natured as she called me to light it again. "Silly boy, you've gone and put out the flame. Come light it again so your old mother can have a look at you." I walked past her sewing needle still clicking as her old chair creaked away merrily. Bending low, I stuck the tip of the candle into the dying flames and saw it wink back to life. Then I turned, candle held out before me, as I started to ask her if that was better. That's when I caught sight of her, and I came to realize why she thought it was so dark. The woman had no eyes. Her face looked like a burlap sack, like a scarecrow whose face has been drawn just a little too well, and as her toothless mouth grinned wetly at me, I saw the hollow pits where her eyes should be. It was the widow, sure as I'm sitting here, and when I dropped the candle onto her, she went up like a pyre. I stood in horror as she burned, her mouth open and spittily, as she laughed and laughed. Such a warm welcome for your old mother. Such a warm welcome. And as she croaked out her cobwebby mirth, I ran for the door. I could feel the heat behind me as the dry boards of the widow's house caught fire, but I never stopped running. I didn't bother with my pack either. I just ran for home, the image of that eyeless old mummy carved permanently into my mind forever. When I got home, my mother was waiting for me, all her bluster at me being late as I threw my arms around her. I never told her what had happened when she asked. At that moment, I was just happy to have the protective walls of her arms around me. I went back for my pack a few days later after school. It was exactly where I had left it, but I couldn't help notice the burnt-out husk of the widow's house. The house had burnt to the ground, nothing left but ashes and charred boards, and I never went near that spot again. The people in town thought it had been the vagrants, and I never tried to dissuade them of that idea. The children I told the story to never seemed to believe me, and I was always careful not to tell it to any adults. They might think it was an omission of guilt, and I didn't want anyone to think it was a fire I had set on purpose. The spot remains barren to this day. Nothing will grow there, and nature seems unwilling to come and retake the place. I've thought about going back there to pay my respects sometimes, but it's not a place I would ever want to return to. I think deep down I'm still afraid of seeing her there, toothless mouth laughing and sunken pits looking for her lost son. It's an image I'll carry forever. The crackling fire caught a pine knot then, and I was pulled from the story as I jumped. Is there anything in those woods that isn't horrifying? I asked, finishing my beer as I threw the bottle out into the woods. This was a habit I had picked up from Grandpa, and it seemed as natural as breathing now. Of course there is. You've seen some of it. But the world is full of dangers that, much like any animal, can be conquered if you know how. Your studies are coming along well. By the time you learn all I have to teach, I'm sure I won't feel so hesitant about dying. I patted his hand and said, hopefully we won't have to figure that out for a long time yet. He smiled, but I thought it looked a little sad. We can only hope. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Well, how lucky are you guys? A trip to Stragview and a trip to Grandpa's house, all in 1 week. We're really painting Georgia red, I reckon. If you enjoy these stories and what we do on the channel, I'd always recommend that you subscribe, maybe hit that notification button, maybe leave me a comment. The algorithm monster loves when people comment. As we head into July, I'd be surprised if this was the last trip to Grandpa's house. I'm thinking of writing some spooky summer tales coming up shortly, so I expect we'll see Grandpa and maybe some Boy Scout tales and maybe even a new Stragview story in the near future. Who knows? Anything's possible, I suppose. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Xaronana for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributor. And thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostly Writer tier contributor. Thanks, everybody. Just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. With my new book coming out pretty shortly, I always recommend that people sign up for our Ghostly Reader tier contribution tier, just like Xaronana. That means you get a book every time I write one, signed and on your doorstep, as well as, having your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube, and getting your story a day early. It's a great tier, and it really helps out around here, so if you'd consider it, I sure would appreciate it. Any contribution is, of course, appreciated wholeheartedly, and I'm always just honored to know that you guys love what I do here. But that's all the time we have for tonight. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.